Thousands rallied to defend the re-election of President Evo Morales in Bolivia. We hear from Ecuador's former foreign minister about attempts to undermine the poll. More protests on the second day of a national strike in Chile. Demonstrators gather outside a police station where they say one protester was tortured. And in Algeria, hundreds of lawyers take to the streets to demand justice reform. From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South, and I'm Camila Escalante. Thousands have turned out in the Bolivian city of Cochabamba to defend President Evo Morales' victory in last Sunday's elections.
No volverán, no volverán, no volverán.
The right will not return, chanted the president and the crowd, just hours after the president declared his re-election in the first round. With just hundredths of a percentage of the votes yet to be counted, President Morales has exceeded the 10% lead required to avoid a runoff. The few votes which remain are in rural areas, where he is expected to do well.
Brothers and sisters, who is really seeking fraud? It's those who burn the voting records, who set fire to the electoral offices in Pando, Chuquisaca, in Sucre and Potosí. They are the ones seeking fraud. We respect the election results. Yesterday, they organized a so-called coordination in defense of democracy. But that is a coordination in defense of fraud. Why are they afraid of completing the official count? Why won't they let the local electoral authorities finish their count? Because they know that we have already won, and with the remaining votes from the countryside, we will win by even more.
For more on Bolivia, I'm joined by Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Economic and Policy Research and former Foreign Minister of Ecuador, Guillaume Long. Bolivia's opposition are trying to claim fraud in the elections in which Evo Morales has announced victory. Is there any validity to these claims?
So at the center, we've been following the Bolivian elections closely, and I have to say that we're very concerned about this kind of, I would call a framing, the growing framing in the international press, which is actually encouraging the Bolivian opposition to follow this narrative of a fraudulent election. We have seen no evidence of fraud. We followed the tendency very carefully. We followed the vote count very carefully. And so far, everything that the mathematicians have been predicting has been happening, looking at the different actas from the different regions. We've double checked on the quick vote, on the slow count, on the quick count, sorry, on the slow count, and everything seems to match. So I think it's dangerous, and it's unwarranted, and it's maybe even politically motivated that we're seeing this narrative around potentially fraudulent elections in Bolivia, when what we should all be doing, including the Bolivian election and certainly the international news corporations, we should be waiting for the results to be issued. Right now, we're on 99.1% of the count counts the last time I looked. And we do right now have a 10.4% lead in favor of Evo Morales. I've seen some of the news coverage saying that it's a tight race. It's a tight race in terms of whether there is a 10% margin in favor of the candidate, Evo Morales. It's not a tight race between the first and the second candidate. So there's been a lot of disinformation there. Just to remind our audience that Evo Morales to be elected needs either 50% plus one of the votes or 40% and a 10-point margin. And so far, with 99.1% of the vote counted, he has got that 10% margin. Well, I've been very surprised by the OAS's behavior during the Bolivian elections. First, they issued a press release on Monday, which is not the kind of thing that the OAS electoral missions do, unless there's a real massive problem, as there was in the Honduran elections. I myself have been a member of OAS electoral missions. I have actually been the head of an OAS mission in Bolivia, so I know the system quite well. And, you know, the OAS's press release was none of the things they've said have been very technical. Usually the OAS is very technical in the details that they give, you know, the kinds of things that they've observed. These press releases have been very political, and then you saw a backtrack on the following day, which sort of hints at the possibility that there's some divisions inside the OAS, because the second press release said the reverse of the first one. And then the preliminary report, which was issued yesterday, essentially calls for a second round, for a runoff, without giving any evidence of irregularity. The only vague irregularity it mentions is that the state may have participated in the campaign, but then the OAS usually complains that Latin American states, governments, if you like, participate in campaigns too much, and they always have that in their reports, and it's never been a reason for discarding or not validating the electoral results in Latin America. So suddenly they're using this, which is a change in the argument. It's a hurried report. It's a 5-page report when the reports are usually much longer. And now it's been elevated even before the final vote count to the Permanent Council of the OAS in Washington, and is being discussed by the ambassadors there. So it's a very political response on behalf of the OAS, and its electoral missions are usually very technical. So it's made us at the center here very suspicious about what the real motivations are behind the OAS's behavior.
And you yourself visited Bolivia during your time as foreign minister. What was your impression of the Mas government's process of change?
Well, I mean, what's happened in Bolivia over the last 15 years, almost 14 years since Evo has been in the presidency, is quite remarkable. I think it's one of the great economic success stories of Latin America in history, probably, and it has had economic but also social consequences and political consequences. It's created stability in a country which was dramatically unstable for decades, the strengthening of institutions, so on and so forth, and the reduction of poverty, the reduction of inequality. If you visit Bolivia now, it is nothing like the Bolivia of 10-15 years ago, which explains the longevity of the Morales government and explains the current electoral results, which are not final, but certainly put Evo in first place, 10 points ahead of the next contender, and probably with a high probability that he will be re-elected. It's a consequence of these changes, and having also a Bolivian that resembles Bolivian people, an indigenous Bolivian at the presidency. A real decolonization of Bolivian politics has taken place in the last 15 years, and I think we should all celebrate that.
This morning, President Morales spoke about racism as playing into the lack of recognition of the rural vote. With most of the official results in, do you sense a concerted effort by the opposition to try to suppress or silence the sectors which have supported him?
Yeah, I think it's always been a sort of unleveled playing field. The left in Latin America has always struggled. It's had a lot of internal enemies, very pre-modern feudal elites, close to feudal elites, sort of very opposed to change, very opposed to even sort of modernization of capitalism, let alone socialism. And international allies, so the United States, the OAS, big international powers that have supported all sorts of campaigns against leftist governments in Latin America, in some cases openly supported destabilization. Yeah, it's always difficult to try and transform a country like the Mas and Evo Morales has tried to do, and others in the region, when you have all these great powers on different levels and powerful interest groups and lobby groups and corporate groups trying to prevent you from doing it. And certainly I think Evo has a point when he mentions the word racism, which is very important to him. You could use other words, sort of neo-colonial attitude, imperial attitudes, all these kinds of attitudes that stand in the way of real democracy, actually, in Latin America. So yes, I understand what Evo means.
Thank you so much for your insight, Guillaume Long, Senior Fellow at the Center for Economic and Policy Research and former Foreign Minister of Ecuador. Hope to have you again soon. We'll take a short break now. Join us again in a minute. Welcome back. On the second day of a general strike in Chile, the organizers are calling on people to hold community assemblies or cabildos, to discuss the future of the country. Assemblies like this are intended as a step towards a constituent assembly to bring sweeping changes to Chile's political system. They're being held at universities and communities and on the streets as protesters again gather in the center of Santiago and across the country. The lower house of Chile's Congress has voted in favor of reducing the work week to 40 hours. The proposal still has to pass through committees and the Senate. It's one of several initiatives by President Sebastián Piñera in the wake of the protests, but they seem to have little impact on the protesters who say it's too little too late.
I have signed and sent to Congress today a law project that creates a mechanism to stabilize energy prices. Tomorrow I will sign and send to Congress a draft legislation that allows an increase in pensions, which will favor almost 3 million pensioners.
The official number of people killed in the last week of protests still stands at 15, although the Doctors Association puts it at 23, while over 5,000 have been arrested. A lawyer for the University of Chile says it's the worst repression since military rule.
The information we're getting from doctors and health centers is that this kind of situation hasn't been seen since the dictatorship. The doctors say there has never been such a large number of people arrested or so much violence against them since the military dictatorship.
Hundreds of protesters gathered outside of a police station in the neighborhood of Peñalolén to denounce torture. They say a protester named Vivona was brought here and subjected to horrendous abuse. Human rights organizations say that at least 30 of those arrested have been tortured. On Wednesday, an alleged torture center was discovered in one of Santiago's subway stations. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, has announced that she is sending a mission to Chile to investigate allegations of human rights violations. Telesur correspondent Alejandro Kirk is near Plaza Italia, in the center of Chile's capital, Santiago, where large crowds have gathered. He has the details.
It's been a week now, 7th day of demonstrations here in Santiago, Plaza Italia, Italy Square, and the entire country. The whole country is being ruled now by military officers under the conditions of the state of emergency decreed by President Piñera. Lawyers are questioning the legality of the entire situation in the country now because it's this state of emergency is in practice being applied as a state of siege. Officers are determining many things that correspond to the civilian authorities. People are now recalling whatever happened 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when Pinochet was ruling. We are now coming from a meeting of University of Chile lawyers who are defending people and denouncing human rights violations. 23 people are reported dead, 100 of them severely injured, 30 cases of torture have been denounced, and one person at least is missing. Somebody has been finding bullets on the streets corresponding to assault rifles of the army. And the night seems to be very dangerous now for anybody walking on the streets. So this is very similar now to what could be called a dictatorship and approaching what lawyers say is state terrorism.
Thank you, Alejandro, for that report. Supporters of the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela have been marching in support of the people of Chile. The demonstration was called to give solidarity to the peoples who have revolted against neoliberal policies, not just in Chile, but in Ecuador, Haiti, and elsewhere. The marchers said that uprisings in those countries show how those policies have failed. Our correspondent Leonel Ratemal has more from the march in Caracas.
We're in one of the main streets in the center of Caracas where a demonstration is taking place in support of the people who have risen up in Latin America and the Caribbean, the Haitian people, the Ecuadorian people, and now especially the Chilean people. The main speakers have referred to these struggles and particularly to the rejection of the neoliberal model that the right has tried to implement in the region, especially in Chile, where this neoliberal model was first applied 3 decades ago as a sort of laboratory for the rest of the world. So the Bolivarian people gathered here are sending a warm salute of solidarity to the Chilean people who are on the streets now. And they're also calling for an immediate end to the repression and many abuses of human rights that have been taking place in recent days in Chile. Leaders of the revolution are speaking now, saying that the winds of Bolivarian change are blowing through Latin America as people seek their freedom and independence and oppose any kind of imperialist intervention in the region, whether by the United States directly or through the neoliberal policies of the IMF.
People in London have also been expressing solidarity with Chile. Our correspondent Pablo Navarrete is in London, where crowds have also gathered to protest against the economic policies of Chilean President Sebastián Piñera, while calling for an end to the militarization.
About 100 people have gathered at the foot of the London Eye, one of London's most iconic tourist attractions, to protest the ongoing violence by the Sebastián Piñera government in Chile. What started a week ago or so, initially through a rise of bus fares, has spread in Chile, and international solidarity protests such as this have been taking place across the UK. On Monday, around 300 people congregated outside the Chilean embassy to protest the repression by state security services in Chile. There have also been protests in Dublin, in Edinburgh, in Cambridge and in other UK cities. Those here are students, members of trade unions and members of British civil society expressing solidarity with the social movements who are uprising against the neoliberal policies of the Sebastián Piñera government in Chile.
Mexico's President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has added his voice to criticisms of neoliberal policies. He said that countries that resist change will eventually encounter problems.
I believe it's time to change the economic model that countries and governments across Latin America and the rest of the world have been using for decades. The so-called neoliberal economic model has become obsolete. It has ended up a total failure.
We'll take a short break now. Join us again after this. Welcome back. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has called for a general election on December 12th to break the Brexit deadlock after the Parliament rejected his timetable. Johnson said if the EU offers Britain another Brexit extension to January 31st, then he would get his exit deal ratified by November 6th. But if he fails to do so, the issue would have to be resolved in the election. The Parliament will vote on whether to hold an early election on Monday.
We've had 3.5 years to discuss this. We're being very, very reasonable. We're saying if you genuinely want more time, you can have it. Here it is. But the condition for that is that we all agree to go for a general election on December the 12th. And the reason for having that deadline is because otherwise I don't think the people of this country are going to believe that Parliament is really going to do it by that deadline, because they spent 3.5 years failing to do it. So let's get it done and let's come out of the EU.
Hundreds of Algerian lawyers marched across the capital, Algiers, calling for reform of the justice system. Lawyers also demanded to put an end to the so-called telephone justice, which sees arrests and trials without evidence. According to a committee that defends detainees, just last week a journalist was detained on charges of undermining the morale of the army. Algeria has been rocked by weekly mass protests since February that led to the ousting of President Bouteflika and forced authorities to detain many senior officials on corruption charges as well.
Today we demand the independence of the Justice Authority. The Justice Authority must be independent. We have to get rid of telephone justice. We have to get rid of revenge justice. And to build a country of law, we need a strong and independent justice system.
Russia is seeking to strengthen its ties with African countries, with President Vladimir Putin announcing the cancellation of a $20 billion U.S. debt $20 billion U.S. debt to the continent at the Africa-Russia summit. Our correspondent has more on how this arrangement will affect South Africa.
South Africa and Russia relations date back to the dark apartheid days. Some of the country's freedom fighters have either studied or received military training in Moscow, but now relations are more about economic and political cooperation. In a historic moment, Russia has landed the world's biggest military planes at a military base in Pretoria on Wednesday in a rare display of cooperation between the two countries. The two Blackjack bombers, capable of launching missiles, are the first to ever land on African soil. The arrival of the aircrafts in Africa's most industrialized nation comes as Russia hosts for the first time 40 African heads of state in Sochi. Russia is now competing with China and the United States for stronger economic ties on the continent. In a move to escalate the race, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced some debt relief for African nations.
Our country is taking part in an initiative to ease the debt burden on African countries. The total sum of debt written off currently amounts to $20 billion. Along with several other countries, joint programs to put debts towards financing national economic growth have been launched.
With Africa's colonial history with Europe, President Putin emphasized that relations between his country and Africa should not benefit one party more than the other. Russia is also trying to change its image on how it relates with other countries. President Putin says his country is now one of the top 10 largest suppliers of food to the African market. He says there are more exports of agricultural products to the markets than weapons. But that's an image that will be difficult to change in South Africa after the historic landing of those two Blackjack bombers in Pretoria. Matuba Mahlachi for Telesur in Pretoria, South Africa.
Anti-government protests continue in Guinea. Tens of thousands of protesters have taken to the streets in the capital against President Alpha Condé. Protesters accuse the president of trying to bypass a ban on a third term in office. The march went peacefully, and contrary to previous protests that opposition says had led to 10 people's deaths, while authorities put the toll at 8. On Tuesday, a court sentenced 5 opposition leaders to 6 to 12 months in jail for organizing protests on October 14th. Turkey's president says Ankara will use its right to crush Kurdish fighters that have not withdrawn from northern Syria as per a truce agreement with the United States.
Now, our soldiers and Syrian National Army are patrolling the area of the operation inch by inch, and they destroy the traps. If any of these terrorists come across us there, it is our natural right to crush them, as this is already marked in written documents. If the terror group is removed from the area with all their elements at the end of the determined time, this agreement with Russia will be implemented successfully. If the terror group keeps disturbing our country from these areas, we will continue to implement our plans for an offensive.
Jamaica's 8-time Olympic medalist Usain Bolt has been selected to receive the 2019 International Humanitarian Award in New York this Friday. Bolt is joined by fellow national Dr. Glenford Christian, the founder and chairman of the Carey Med Group of companies. The duo will be honored for their philanthropy and contributions to Jamaica's economic development after being nominated by the American Friends of Jamaica. The world's fastest runner established the Usain Bolt Foundation back in 2011. It provides support to a number of entities and hosts an annual Christmas treat. We've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And we're on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Camila Escalante. Thanks for watching.